intellectual disobedience. Intellectual, our academics, our scholarship, our analysis. Disobedience, right? To disobey, to not give authority to not accept their rule by controlling our minds. A deep and profound awareness that we as the Kanaka have an ethical imperative to oppose and resist all attempts by the dominant settler agents. Yeah, so whether they're the University of Hawaii, the Department of Education, or others who want to regulate, restrict, and determine the subject matter and the purposes of our re-education is something that, first of all, we must challenge at all levels. We must combat these attempts to try to shape and contain the control of our minds. The greatest weapon of the oppressor are the minds of the oppressed, as the great Stephen Biko said. So we must at all times challenge that control, which mainly comes in the form of miseducation through the so-called educational institutions. So whether it's the subject matters that we are forced to study, or more importantly, the subject matter of education that is withdrawn, which has been thrown to the side and has been ignored, is more important. We have to pay attention to make sure that we bring that kind of information, education to the upcoming generations. We must resist the imposition and normalization, that's a good normalization, of Euro-American centric worldview as universal and paramount. The so-called Euro-Americans do not hold a monopoly on ideas of truth, on philosophies of democracy, on understandings of what is right or wrong. They have no moral basis to judge on us what we should teach or not teach. And the control of our minds, the control of our intellectual ideas, our education, and to refuse that propaganda, to struggle against that menticide, to organize against that mind control, is a preeminent act and manifestation having liberated so-called native mind. The great Nigerian scholar Chinwisu, in his book, Decolonizing the African Mind, he has this very important quote, which I find so powerful and so related and associated to what is going on with the minds of so-called native peoples. The central objective in decolonizing the African mind, or we could say the native mind, is to overthrow the authority. That's the key word, authority. Okay? Their subjugation, their domination, which alien traditions exercise over the African, for us, the native. This demands the dismantling of white supremacist beliefs. Think about it, the beliefs, whether it's religious, so-called white Jesus, whether it's the idea that they discovered so-called new lands, whether it's even the idea that all great inventions and histories and ideas of democracy have come from the Euro-Americans. And those structures that uphold them, that we must challenge at every corner. But what's important, I think what he also says, that the decolonization of the mind does not mean ignorance of foreign traditions. It doesn't mean we don't want to know them. It doesn't mean we don't have to, we can't appreciate them. It doesn't mean we cannot find a beauty or power from them. It simply means the denial of their authority. Again, denial of their authority. So we no longer accept that power that they have over us to determine for us our goals, to determine for us, right? To really determine for us what we want and need as peoples. And importantly, to withdraw of our allegiance to them. That's the first part. We must not allow that allegiance to somehow believe that we have to come seek their approval. We constantly have to turn to their scholarships, their analysis, their ideas of, for example, what democracy is and could be. That we should not look to them to say that their morals are universal and is something that should reach all over all of us around the world. You know, Toni Morrison, in her piece from her speech actually back in Portland State, back in 1975, says, "It is important, therefore, to know who the real enemy is and to know the function, the very serious function of racism, which is distraction. And the greatest distraction happens with the so-called intellectuals, the scholars, the academics, who get stuck in somehow finding ways to seek approval, acceptance. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being, who we were, what is our history, our so-called humanity, that somehow we have to prove to them our humanity. That we come from a real people, with a real history, with a real language, with a real religion. And so once we get caught up in those kinds of academic formats, we are really, as she says here, getting caught in explaining over and over without having real change. Academics and the liberated mind has to be about a shift in power, the returning of our power to determine for ourselves a future. It cannot be caught and stuck in this wheel and cycle of somehow proving to the oppressor, to the settler, to the so-called colonizer, that we should be looked at as real human beings. As she says, none of that is necessary. We do not need to seek their approval. We have no need to look to them for morality. That's the last thing we should be looking to them for. And in fact, we should be doing the work that we need to do, as she says, because that is keeping us from doing the actual work that we need to do, which is to build for ourselves our future, to determine for ourselves where we need to go.